This was a really rich, particularly rich year for us for the submission of translations for the Wolff Prize. There were a great many that were superb and interesting. This applied to the nonfiction entries as well. It was really a pleasure reading so many wonderful books and interesting, as I said. Early on, though, one book did stand out, and that was Vincent Kling's translation of Die Strudlhof Steps by Heimito von Doderer. He's an Austrian novelist who died in 1966. It's a fascinating, totally engrossing work, in translation some 850 pages. And its author is a fixture in the German literature canon, but still quite underknown outside of Austria. Even in Germany, I've been told, I don't know. It was published in 1951 and only now is being published in English. Vincent Kling, a translator and professor of German at La Salle University, has spent around 5 years making this epic work available for English language readers. It introduces us to a Viennese group of, in the words of Francine Prose, bright, young, and not so bright or young things. A cast of characters including soldiers, government officials, minor aristocrats, ingenues, petty crooks, musicians, innkeepers, shopkeepers, and all involved with each other in complicated and amorphous relationships. It's a world unto itself. As Shelley said, the two time periods are 1908 to 11 and 1923 to 25. The range of characters, accents, vocations, idiolects is immense. Pity the poor translator. The book is a treasure trove, or a Pandora's box, containing all the difficulties and challenges a prize-worthy translation should meet and master. And this Vincent has certainly done brilliantly. This novel is an evocation of a life and a Vienna that no longer exists. In this Vienna, it is almost always beautiful spring and summer weather. It hardly rains or snows. The wine is flowing, the music is playing. World War I is barely mentioned. There are no Nazis, and its description of nature and the countryside is like a 20th century Stifter. This book is so huge and sprawling, I can only give a few examples of the challenges that translator has faced and triumphed over. First, though, what are these Strudlhof Steps? They are a construction from the 1910s commissioned by the notorious mayor Karl Lueger, a sort of attenuated double helix on a site once owned by a 17th century sculptor and painter named Peter Strudel. These steps are in the Alsergrund district in Vienna, and they still exist today. There's a picture of them on the cover of the German edition. And they are the site of several crucial events in the novel. They also function, however, as a nexus for the many intersecting threads of the novel. Here they are, as seen by Major Melzer, a character who is somewhat reminiscent in his naivete of the Magic Mountain's Hans Castorp. Quote, "For the first time ever, he examined this feat of engineering with a measure of attentiveness, thereby separating himself inwardly from an unending file of passers-by who every day tread underfoot what they, for that very reason, have never seen. It mounted up, or rather it reached down, placing into orderly arrangement the steep drop-off, truncated and abrupt by nature, of the terrain here, dividing the tight-lipped, nearly barren, all too pat statement the terrain made into an abundance of graceful turnings, which the eye could no longer just dart downward in a fast swoop to follow, but had instead to lower its gaze as gently as a falling autumn leaf swaying softly through the air." End of quote. The English rendering using words like tight-lipped, all too pat, and dart is very free, very creative, and yet totally faithful to the music and intent of the German. That autumn leaf comes back quite a bit in this book. The book is about style and sound of language and about memory and repetition. Vincent Kling is as attentive to detail here as is Melzer in his observation of the steps. The attentiveness to detail is characteristic throughout of both the writer and the translator, and the detailed description of the landscape and the architect is a constant leitmotif of Doderer. He was Viennese, and one hallmark of his writing is its sly, humorous distance. This aspect of Viennese humor, I think it is called schmäh, can be slightly nasty. Right on page 1, we meet Dr. Negria, a Romanian immigrant from the and immigrants from the Balkans are described here as Balkaneers, an unmissable reference, of course, to buccaneers, mercenary ones. We meet Major Meltzer, who is described constantly as stupid by Mary, whom he is interested in. He eventually turns out to be a hero, however. At some point around 1908, Meltzer is transferred to Bosnia, where he's planning to go bear hunting. Mary asks him to bring her back the bear skin so that she can, in Vince's translation, quote, put it on the same way you've been putting me on. Sure enough, putting a bear skin on someone means pulling their leg in German. In describing the faces of two rather dim women, quote, we'll venture to say both visages are positioned in front of an almost unimaginable vacuum. You can see that nastiness. Mary's unattractive husband, Oscar, has a, quote, face that has not quite achieved cohesion, a face that is at once the display case and construction site, that's Schau- und Bauplatz, of highly incompatible material, which have not yet managed to become unified in their forebears, and have now fallen into a state of crash and trash, Zerknall und Zerfall, as after an explosion. Another character reads Schopenhauer with romantic enthusiasm, but isn't really on the right intellectual level. Her learning is described as, quote, wunderliche Umbildung durch Unbildung bis zu einem fruchtbaren und letzten Endes furchtbaren Missverständnis, which Kling renders as, quote, wondrous transmogrification via discombobulation that reached the point of fruitful but ultimately frightful misunderstanding. Similarly, there are many rhyming or nearly rhyming word pairs in the German, which Kling retains in English, as in a lady's hypochondriac fits of symptoms, Beklemmung mit Entzündung turns into churning with burning. In another episode, Meltzer is worried about an upcoming romantic assignation. He is desperate with self-doubt. The German word for desperation is Verzweiflung, coming from the word for doubt, Zweifel. His desperation is described here, quote, not a shadow of a doubt existed as to the real nature of their appointment, but every doubt in the world rose up in Meltzer during the 3 days preceding. Finally, he was crushed by them, like grain between two millstones, the whole whirling in panic, the whole works overheating, the whole operation redoubtable. Okay. Describing the face of a bullying father named, comically, Schmella, bullies look like thugs. Their real face is the nape of their neck. They have their faces on the backs of their heads. This is where the clever knack, the trick, the jape of these napesters comes in. In German, hier liegt der Kniff und Trick jener Genickler. This same crude character looks at people, quote, cold yet interested, the way an expert looks things over, especially at everything pertaining to people, whom he knew the way the butcher knows the calf. The perceived vain snobbishness of a character on the rise, René Stangeler, he is described as Herr von und zu René. These untranslatable particles of nobility become, in English, Herr Nose in the air. His sister Etelka is relishing her freedom in Turkey with her new husband, and Mr. Kling describes her former unmarried life as Duranceville. I actually had to look that up. It means a long prison term, and I guess in some French legal system. A very creative way, in any case, to translate Unfreiheit. And later, when Mary and Dr. Negria run into each other years after each stood the other up, They have a forcedly polite conversation. Quote, nie unterhält man sich so lebhaft, wie wenn es darauf ankommt, nicht auf das zu kommen, wovon eigentlich alles herkommt. Kling's version is brilliant. People never converse more vivaciously than when they tacitly set out to offset whatever had set them off at the outset. Brilliant, brilliant. One major character, the alcoholic, womanizing Prussian cavalry officer, boy, that's a big job right there. Eulenfeld has the title Master of Horse, or Rittmeister. His peers in the army call him Zerrüttmeister, Zerrüttung meaning ruination. He has famously been involved with many women in the novel, not to their benefit, for which fact he is nicknamed Zerrüttmeister, which Kling translates as disaster of course, rhyming of course with master of horse. Sexual currents run through the work, sometimes, but not always, understated. And Doderer and Kling handle it quite forthrightly. For example, here, at the end of a crucial scene between René Stangeler and young Editha, where he helps her down a mountainside while rock climbing, ending in a well-thought-out conquest. Quote, he started to kiss her, and it was in keeping with the spirit of the occasion when he unbuttoned her white sports shirt and slipped his right hand under her left breast. She let herself be all but carried the rest of the way down. Bracket, as they descend, he gets excited. End of bracket. She gave just one yelp of pain, but it was very brief and stifled. Then she wrapped herself very tight around René, and not only with her arms. Kling lets the reader appreciate the difference in registers between Viennese expressions and standard German spoken by non-native speakers. Editha Pacheret, French-Swiss, speaks fluent standard German but makes slips in usage. In the middle of her Viennese, quote, effusions, she says, quote, perish the thought, or she speaks of, quote, bidding good day, instead of saying hello or grüßen. Meltzer is charmed by this doctoring of her language. Doderer compares it to what one does when one cuts a shot in tennis. You're sort of adding a value to it, but very effectively. A character appears named Scheichsbeutel. Meltzer, appalled, cries, how can anybody be named Scheichsbeutel? Meltzer decides to label his wastebasket with this name. German speakers will understand how nearly obscene the name is, but the English translation adds, quote, the first syllable had too many fecal overtones. The second, too many suggestions of a pouch or a bag, not to be weirdly suitable. Now that's a pretty darn good in-text translation or circumlocution. There are challenges with technical and equipment nomenclature too. There's a passage involving archery where the fletching or the feathering of an arrow and the knock of the bow are crucial metaphors of Stangeler's black mood. I confess I did not know these words either. Music is a theme as well. There is a sequence parodying Schubert's Schöne Müllerin, a well-known romantic theme, but here the mill race is described in great detail, and then it breaks off. And he says, the mill doesn't run all the time. Forget about das Wandern ist des Müllers Lust. This miller has a defective leg and can't think about wandering anywhere. The miller's name is Klettler, and here Kling clarifies the name, quote, meaning Burman and Burrs Kling. So here in English, the miller gets a name change. He becomes Burman, Burrs stick and stay put. Well, this miller happens to be a wife beater. So after 47 years of marriage, Mrs. Burman leaves. A little further on, the adjoining inn is described as in a tourist brochure. The rooms were cozy with deep, heavy beds and eiderdown comforters, etc., etc. But then, quote, the candlesticks on the night table could probably have been used to beat a strong man to death. Doderer is full of surprises like this. It's probably just as well Mrs. Burman moved out. In reading this novel, I found myself often thinking of Proust, Here is Stangler walking from one room to another, quote. But what he was really doing during those few seconds was in fact walking into and through himself, the way a man might walk through a long, straight set of doors, leaving all the doors open as he passes through, so that at the far end, his glance can turn back unimpeded to the beginning, the time before he had met Goethe, the time when it would have been entirely possible for him to live without her. Like Proust's Swan, indeed, the theme of memory is in the subtitle, Meltzer, or the depths of the years. As in Proust, there are frequent psychological excursions into the character's thought processes, illuminated by metaphors, similes, constant recurring motifs of music, flowers, scents. Lavender water is huge in this book. Foods, coffee, a leitmotif on its own. What linden tea was for Marcel, coffee seems to be for Meltzer. Places like the Graben in Vienna, the Ringstrasse, and the Vienna woods surrounding the city become as important to the narrative as any character, just as in Proust's Paris and Cambrai. Memories and recollections are key elements of the novel. Kling evokes Proustian memory when Editha, René's mistress, warns him not to bring up the past, saying in almost Wagnerian archaic German, quote, "Gemahnen Sie mich nicht des Gewesenen," which Kling renders as, quote, "Do not summon up remembrance of things past." This English title of Proust's work is really Shakespeare, so is this a tip of the hat from one translator to another? Indeed, the work of translation is a theme in itself in Doderer, and in this book, who seems to know his classical languages. Stangler, as a student, is called upon to render Latin into correctly scanning German on the spot, an ability you don't encounter in many characters nowadays, real or fictional. A character quotes the medieval Carmina Burana in its original Latin, and René correctly guesses its origin and then gives a note-perfect translation in German. Vincent Kling's translation is accordingly note-perfect. I don't know whether to read it or not. Vinum bonum et suave, bonis bonum pravis prave. Cunctis sapa dulcis ave, mundane laetitia. Sounds like the song, right? And he translates it as wine so mellow, of bouquet, good to the good, the bad's dismay. You who sweeten sleep and rest, cheerfulness be ever blessed. Another major theme is the Austrian bureaucratic language, which is the particular hallmark of one character, Inspector Zihal, whose pompous officialese comes to be termed Upper Zihalese. Here, how is his change of residence is described. Quote, Julius Zihal, a senior counselor in the Central Bureau of Revenue and Tariff Computation, had, comma, rich in attainments and honors, comma, entered retirement status in the year of our Lord 1913, and had soon thereafter, comma, occasioned by that circumstance, changed his place of residence, a circumstance that does not appear comprehensible without some additional elucidation, as we herewith readily concede, end of quote. Another language thematic is the Vienna dialect from the neighborhoods, to use Vincent's term. When it is revealed that Editha has a twin sister identical, a character responds, "Ah, das Scharja, geh hörst," which he translates as, "Get out of here, for real?" Just as common and real sounding as anything in Nestroy, I suppose. Like René's father beaming with pride at his son's ad hoc translation, the reader can only applaud Mr. Kling's virtuosic versatility. The theme of translation actually reappears between the lines in the book's last paragraph. Early on in the giant novel, we hear an aria from Fledermaus, sung by Lasker, Meltzer's mentor. Glücklich ist, wer vergisst, was doch nicht zu ändern ist, which you probably all know means if you want to be happy, forget about what you can't change. This iconic theme of the golden age of operetta comes back in the very last paragraph in different form when our civil service counselor Zihal defines happiness in a toast to Major Meltzer at his wedding luncheon. quote, "Happiness does not come when you forget your stress. That is something I do not profess. Such a thing can only happen in an operetta. No, happiness is much more likely to occupy the domain of a person the extent of whose own demands remain so far behind the decision reaching said person from a higher quarter that a considerable residue of contentment naturally ensues." End of quote. What else can we say? Isn't that the major to perfection? And those are the last words, as Shelley has already told us. And as Shelley's announcement put it, it's the last word of the book and of the translation. Congratulations, and many, many thanks to Vincent Kling for this awe-inspiring, monumental task of opening up this work for the English-speaking world. Thank you, Vincent.